Hi, everyone. I'm Hope Arias, one of the branch managers at Realty Advantage.
And I'm Christine Gray. I'm another one of your branch managers here in Rockville.
And I'm Mike Rival, also a branch manager and broker here at Realty Advantage. We appreciate your time. It's August of 2024. As everyone knows, we've gone through a lot these past 2 weeks as the changes become implemented from the NAR settlement. So we just wanted to kind of put this together, walk you through some of the new forms that we're working with. And again, this will change from time to time. So as of today, this is the guidance that's out there, but it's being updated pretty much on a weekly basis. So check back regularly. One great website that we've shared in the past is from NAR. It's facts.realtor. Check it out. It's got a lot of great resources in there for agents, but also it's got guidance and tips for buyers and sellers. It's a good idea to take a look through all of that material. We've put together a support page for you on our website. We'll show you where that is. Again, videos on there from GCAAR, MAR, and links to some of the new forms. Also, there's been a ton of great webinars out there from random boards of realtors, but also title companies. So again, make sure you're taking advantage of all of those. Again, that's the website for the NAR website. There's videos in there, a lot of Q&A that can really be helpful for you in guiding your clients through these next few weeks. As we mentioned on the website, we've put together a bunch of resources. We've got an MAR video on there, very detailed. It's about 2.5 hours, but it covers a lot of the changes that we're going through. We've got a great video in there from GCAAR, also links to the forms, which we'll be covering today. We'll be posting this video on here as well. So make sure you check out that. If you need to find the agent support page, it's on the bottom right of our website. That'll take you there. So hopefully that's helpful. But again, we appreciate your time today. We're going to cover a lot of ground, and hopefully you find it helpful. And we'll start with a lot of the changes that are taking place with MLS. I'll turn it over to Christine Gray.
Yeah, we're just going to touch a few of the main points of all the changes that are happening. We're going to give you some reminders about the Bright MLS rules that have changed and a disclosure that's required there. We'll go over the new buyer broker agreements and touch on the key points there. We will review the required commission addendum. Remember that commission needs to be included in the sales contract now, so we're going to make sure you're getting that documented correctly. And then we'll give you a few listing agreement reminders. Even though this is mainly buyer broker class, there's some important reminders there as well that should be helpful for you.
Yeah, I just want to follow up again. The two major changes that are taking place now that have already gone into effect. One is commissions are no longer an MLS. And the second part that's critical is that commissions need to be written into your contract. So again, we'll walk you through that today.
The first thing is about Bright MLS. The key point is there is no mention of compensation allowed in the MLS or any of the related affiliated sources. So cannot be in remarks. You cannot upload anything to the disclosures. You cannot include it in showing time. We also know that there are some companies that are coming out with third-party website specifically for commission sharing. We do not believe in those, and that already has become a problem as far as the settlement instructions. So we do not condone those. We just want to make sure you guys are careful as far as following the letter of the law with the settlement. And the last thing to remember is Bright MLS does have a required disclosure now. Mike, can you go to the next slide so we can see that one? Yeah, this form is, you can find it in Bright. The top half is for every client. So that is buyers and sellers need to initial the disclosure at the top. And then the bottom half is if it's for a seller client, they have more information down there to initial, but this must be included in every transaction file. Buyer broker agreements, I think we'll hop over to Hope to talk about these.
Yes. So not much has changed with the buyer broker. They're still required. They have been for a while. The only thing is that the amount that is specified in your buyer broker is the max compensation that you can receive, and that is from the seller and from the buyer combined. So if you want a specific amount of, say, a percentage, that is the max percent you can charge from both the sellers and the client. Sorry.
Yeah, there's been a lot of confusion about that too. If you've got an amount in there that is higher than what is being offered by the seller, the buyer is going to be responsible for paying that difference. So again, but it doesn't need to be a specified amount. It can't be TBD for a seller, per MLS, no zeros. There has to be a specific amount. And again, buyer broker agreements have to be signed before you're doing any showings. And this has been, as Hope had mentioned, I think it's been in effect since 2018. This is not new. So what's changed is obviously just making sure that these dollar figures are negotiated and set up front before you start showing property. So it's very transparent what you're charging, what the responsibilities of the buyers are before you get started in the process.
And to Hope's point, make sure the buyers are aware of that max amount too.
Yes.
Meaning if the seller is offering some compensation, but it's less than the amount there, the buyer is going to pay the difference at settlement. But also if your buyer broker is less than what the seller is offering, you can't receive that higher amount unless you get this adjusted so that it states that max amount. That's what's different than the old buyer broker.
And as we go through today, I'll make sure we make a distinction that there's two different sets of forms. They do vary slightly. So just make sure we'll be covering a lot of these forms. Just make sure you're noting that one is for GCAAR, predominantly used in Montgomery County, and then the other ones are the Maryland Realtors form. So we'll be covering both of those today. So just make sure you note that when you're going through this. It's a good idea for you guys to have those forms set aside as you go through this video so you can reference it on your own, and feel free to check back as needed. So we'll go ahead and jump into the forms now. Chris, you want to cover the GCAAR scenarios?
Sure. Yeah. GCAAR allows basically 3 scenarios for the buyer agent to get paid. One is that the seller pays a buyer broker compensation. 2 is that the seller offers concessions that goes toward the buyer, and the buyer can use those concessions toward any of their closing costs. So that can be, settlement fees. It can be the buyer broker fee. It can be they use it later for carpet. That seller concessions to be used for the buyer for any of their costs. And the third is that the buyer pays directly to the broker per the buyer broker agreement. So the first scenario, if the seller is agreeing to pay the buyer broker or some portion of the buyer broker compensation, you need this new addendum. This is Form 1302. Again, this is GCAAR, and it'll document either the percentage or the set dollar amount that the seller is going to pay at settlement toward the buyer's broker compensation. Second scenario is concessions, as they always have been. This is in the addendum clauses, and you'll just set the seller credit there, whether it's a dollar amount or a percentage. And again, the buyer can use that for any of their fees at settlement. And the third, this is also the same as it's always been. If the buyer is going to pay the buyer broker compensation, that is in addendum of clauses B. And we do just want to caution you, obviously make sure you're reading this whole paragraph, but this is intended for if the buyer is paying the full brokerage fee. If you have a scenario where the seller is paying part of it on the addendum we showed you earlier, but the buyer has a balance to pay, just make sure you strike that highlighted line there so that it's clear and there's no conflicting language. The seller is paying part and the buyer is paying part. You just want to make sure the total amount agrees to what is on your buyer broker. Again, it can't exceed that amount. Okay, so Maryland Realtors, the forms are a little bit different, and they do allow for an additional scenario. I know it's a lot, and you might want to go back, and if you haven't already watched the separate webinars, watch this again, just so you're familiar with what's GCAAR versus what's Maryland Realtors. The Maryland Realtors scenarios for the payment of the buyer agent compensation is number 1, the seller can pay the buyer's broker. Number 2, they allow the listing broker to pay the buyer broker. Number 3, again, the seller pays concessions. And number 4, the buyer pays the buyer broker. So MAR also has a form for if the seller is paying the buyer's broker. This one does have a little bit more information on it, just to be careful you get it complete. Read through the whole thing, of course, but number 1 is what's documented if the listing broker is cooperating and already promising to pay a commission to the buyer broker. That's line number 1. So then in addition to the broker to broker, Number two is if the seller is going to directly pay a portion of the buyer broker compensation. And then line number four is basically just the total of those two for the title company to see. So basically, if the listing broker is paying part of it, but then the seller in the negotiations has agreed to pay a little bit more, you just want to make sure that total is on line four.
I just want to stress too how important, more important of a role that the buyer brokerage agreements will take in the transactions. It's going to be a form that may need to be adjusted in the middle of the transaction if you get there. It's also a form that will more than likely, in my opinion, need to be shared with the title company before closing so that they know, hey, what is the buyer's obligation? How much is the seller paying, if any? Who's paying what? So again, it's very important that obviously that agreement is taken care of upfront with the buyer before showing any properties and that it's current. Also make sure we have a copy of the most current one. So if the agreed upon commission is a certain amount and at some point either in a negotiation or through the transaction or a different house, it changes, make sure we have the most recent agreement that you and your buyer client has agreed to.
This is the scenario that's specific to the Maryland Realtors forms. Again, not GCAAR. This is only in the other parts of Maryland. The listing broker can agree to offer cooperative compensation. This is similar to how things used to work, and this form documents that. So the listing broker would be sharing a portion of the commission they're receiving from the seller. They're taking that portion and sharing it with the buyer broker. So that's what this form is for. You'll just document here whether it's a dollar amount or a percentage. And of course, you've got seller concessions, the same as that has always worked. It's just the Maryland Realtors specific addendum for that. And again, the buyer can use that either dollar amount or percentage toward all of their closing cost fees. And the last option is the buyer pays directly to the buyer broker. The GCAAR addendum clauses B can still be used. You can see up top on the header, it says you can use that with the GCAAR contract or with MR. And again, that just documents what the buyer is paying directly. If they're paying the entire thing, then you just leave the paragraph as is. But if there is a portion being paid by the seller, make sure you strike that highlighted sentence just so there's no confusion.
Hope you want to speak to this.
Sure. So with the listing agreements for GCAAR, they did separate the commission amounts to be a little bit more clear. If you want to move on to the next page. So the top portion, A, is the listing broker compensation, which you would receive as the listing agent or Realty Advantage as a listing broker. The second B paragraph is if the client is, the buyer is unrepresented, an additional commission that you would receive. C is for the buyer broker offer of compensation. So if a buyer is represented, the compensation that would be paid to the buyer broker, the buyer's agent. And D is the sub-agent compensation, which is a percentage that you would pay for clients that do not have a buyer broker agreement assigned with an agent. So they did just separate each amount. So the total in A would just be the portion that the listing company will receive. And then you would separate each one pertaining to what the seller is paying.
Yeah, and Hope has mentioned it's nice. They did kind of clean this up a little. It's not a huge change from what we had before, but I do think that section B is going to come into play a little more. Moving forward, we have buyers that may not be working with someone exclusively as far as a buyer agent. So make sure you have that conversation with your sellers. It's going to be a lot more work for you as a listing agent. You're going to have to do a lot of screening, especially if you have buyers calling you straight from Zillow. You don't know if they're qualified, if they have financing. You really know nothing about them. So it's going to be a lot of legwork. So make sure you have those conversations with your seller before you put these numbers in here and negotiate everything out. Okay, Hope.
Also, this is a notice for the seller paid for the offering by buyer broker compensation. Again, this is a notice that the seller would sign off on. The buyer is not required to sign on this. This is something that you can give to agents that are calling requesting to show your property and asking if compensation will be paid. This is just an email that you can send to them if you would like. It's not a required document, but it would be beneficial to have it.
I would suggest if you use this form, you can see the note there in red. I would still note at the bottom that any offer of compensation must be included in the sales contract. So even though you're having this conversation up front to try to help facilitate the transaction, and buyers on the other end can try to understand what to expect, but still that compensation needs to be going into the sales contract on the new addendum. So I would add that note at the bottom if I were to use this form and share it.
Yes, and we definitely don't want to get this one confused with the actual addendum, which is signed by all parties, buyers and sellers. That is a mandatory form with the contract.
Yeah, it's very, very important to drive that point home is the buyer side commission must be part of the contract. It can't be a text message or an email saying, oh, the listing agent said X, Y, and Z. Like, it needs to be part of the contract. So the buyer and seller both signed off, and it's very clear upfront who's being compensated what and by what party.
And then this is the Maryland Realtors listing agreement. And this one works more like how the paperwork used to work. So just make sure, again, you're clear between GCAAR and Maryland Realtors because they're a little different. So this one, compensation at line number 14 is going to be the total that the seller is going to pay. So that will include the total commission that's going to be paid between the listing broker, and then line number 15 is what they're authorizing you or the listing broker to cooperate with a buyer broker. So they'll pay a portion of the total to the other broker.
Yeah, in the past, we've had problems with this form where people are putting the list side commission on the top portion. That should be the gross amount of commission that the seller has agreed to pay upfront. And then, as Chris had mentioned, section 15 is more where you're parsing it out, where the seller has agreed to offer part of that compensation to buyer side brokers. So make sure you guys have that gross amount up top, whatever the seller is agreeable to.
And this is the form that Maryland Realtors has provided, similar to the one that Hope just discussed for GCAAR, as far as the notice of the cooperating commission that's being offered. I just want to be careful with this. The Maryland Realtors one, of course, in their listing agreement, the seller is spelling out what they're going to share as far as the co-op commission. So that's what goes on the first form, and that's what you can share with a buyer agent. But just be very careful. That needs to match what goes in the addendum within the contract, which is the bottom half of this page. So you can either use the form at the top, worst case, include that in the contract, make sure it's documented. But you just want to make sure there's no confusion what the total commission paid is going to be. So you document what's coming from the listing broker, what's being shared, what's already been agreed to. That's the first line in the addendum at the bottom. And then the second is if the seller's offering another piece of it. So just need to make sure everything within your contract and between your listing agreement and your buyer broker, depending on who your client is, make sure it all agrees and it all gets into that sales contract. So there's no confusion and no surprises.
Yeah, I just want to kind of touch base here. Again, I know this has been very challenging first week to week and a half of all this. Just keep in mind that it's not just agents in our office. It's not just you. It's every single realtor in the United States is going through these same processes with different forms, but all accomplishing the same thing, and that's to be in compliance with the new NAR settlement requirements. So again, be patient. It's going to be a little bumpy here. Again, I think we've been introduced to 8 or 9 new forms here in the past 10 days, and guidance seems to be changing again on a weekly basis. So we'll get through this together. We're here to support you guys. But again, it's really, really important. I can't stress this enough to watch every single video resource you can get access to. Read every form line by line. As agents, you are required to answer your clients' questions. So if they have a question about section 17, paragraph 2, what does this mean? You have to be able to explain that to them. So again, we're here as a resource to kind of guide you, but again, it's ultimately you guys are the ones driving the bus here. So make sure you understand this new paperwork. There's a lot to kind of consume here, but again, we're all in this together. We'll get there. We appreciate all your patience, but again, bottom line is we provide a very valuable tool for buyers and sellers out there. It's going to be a bumpy couple of weeks, but again, we're going to stick with this together. And if you have any questions, let us know. We're here for you. Again, thanks for your time, and look forward to the fall season. Take care.